Welcome back, everyone. On this episode of Why Do We Believe What We Believe, we're going to look into why do we believe in fairies? Where did that come from? And while there's a number of ways we can approach that, we're going to approach it through the old Irish Celtic community's way of looking at things, you could say. So today, why do we believe what we believe? The fairies. Let's go. So, the quick answer is, who are the fairies? Well, they are the descendants of the gods, you could say. All right, now, with that out of the way, let's talk about how that is and how we know it. As I discussed in the first video in this series with Loki on the primary source material that I used being the Eddas and the sagas of the Icelanders, what we have in the Celtic tradition was a book that came out during the 11th century, which would have been the 1000s, you could say. And it's called the Book of Invasions. Now, this is written in Ireland at a time when it itself has gone through two major changes since the true Celtic period ended. First, there was the several hundred years of fighting against the Romans and eventually Ireland being taken over by them and Christianized. And then later, by this time, now they've got another problem on their hands, so to speak. This is during the Viking Age. Now they have the people that we're talking about, Loki, now are running around their country, slowly taking it over. And there's a lot of very interesting connections between the Irish and the Norse, and when it comes to Iceland, I'll delve deeper into, in future videos, the idea of the Celtic Icelandic. But for now, that book is going to be the one that I'm going to sort of base what we know, because it's the first written account we have of one of the oldest traditions in the Celtic world, and one that features all of the various gods. When you think of the Celtic world, you got to look at modern day Europe divided up into thousands of little tribes over the years, and they slowly and slowly get smaller and smaller and eventually become nations. But at this time, it was called the land of Erin still, when the Tuatha De Danann arrived. Okay, we just took a jump back from the Viking Age to where we're going with where the gods came from. The gods came because out of the sky one day these ships came, they landed on the shore, and they burned their ships on the shore, and they stepped onto the land, and they were the Tuatha De Danann, tribe of Danu, people of Danu. Danu being this undescribed presence that has a feminine feel that is the mother of all the tribe. Now, the tribe itself is all that we know as the oldest Celtic gods: Lugh, Brigid, Morrigan, all these that you might be particular with, you might know about. If not, we'll certainly have more videos about them. But during their story, they go through a number of challenges in their sort of the way that in the saga of the Icelanders and the Eddas, they talk about all the challenges that the gods had in the Nordic experience. Well, that's where all the stories that we have of the powers of Lugh and his sword and all these things, right? And so, but the third battle there was two at the beginning against the Fomorians and the Firbolg, and I'm not going to mention beyond that. It's a fast one today, okay? So they had these two famous battles in which most of the stories come from. They're collectively called the battles of Montoya, all right? The two battles, there was the first one and the second one. And so they had battle with the Firbolg and they had battle with the Fomorians. But then there's something that happens after that. This is an era where we enter into where the story kind of gets convoluted because we have hero characters come along, things like that. We get to all of a sudden now a third encounter that the Tuatha De Danann have as the rulers of the land of Erin, and they are the Milesians. Okay, now so basically the culmination of this battle is that the Tuatha De Danann get together and ask them for a 3-day truce. And so they agree to do this. And so the Milesians, which were coming out of the ocean, they were not allowed to be within, I think, 9 waves or 9 days or something of the shore. And so during this time, in their usual conniving ways, looking back at some of the ways they won those earlier battles, when the Morrigan, great goddess story, we'll talk about that later in another video. When the Morrigan helped there, they did a similar thing here. They conjured this magic storm that was going to force waves out there and throw the Milesians so far away it was over, but that didn't work. They ended up coming onto the shore and they defeated the Tuatha De Danann. And at that point, the arbiter that sort of decided what was going to happen, and I intentionally leave names out because I don't want to get too sidetracked talking about individuals, but the one who decided what happened next gave the upper world to the Malaysians and the lower world to the Tuatha De Danann. So at this point, the Tuatha De Danann go into these hills, right? They're called the spell is S-I-D-H-E, but you pronounce it she. But it's not she like a feminine she, S-H-E in English, or S-H-I, because then you might say shy, I don't know. But I guess ski, yeah, so she. They go to these she mounds, Tir Nog Mog, okay, that's the name of their capital city, Tir Na Nog. It's hard to, I don't even know if I'm saying it correctly. You can Google it certainly, but that is where their hill is, these hills they go into. Then they become the she. Their descendants become the she. And they are said to reside off the western waters in these things called fairy forts. And the she also at this time developed into what's called the Fae. Some of the immediate descendants, perhaps the gods themselves, become the Fae. It's not clear, but the Fae emerge as they went into the she. They're sometimes referred to as the she, sometimes as the Fae, but it's the same thing. It's the descendants of the Tuatha De Danann that had gone into the underworld, literally under. And so they had these fairy forts, and so over time, she was left out of the picture. Fae grew into fairy because of the fairy forts, and eventually you have the fairies. And so when you talk about the fairies today, right, in the Celtic experience, how they would have regarded that, because those would have been the stories they knew, all right? And so just like Ragnarok in the Nordic people knew that the gods they were supposed to be engaging with have already been killed in Ragnarok, so it's a weird twist. Same thing goes on here in the Celtic tradition, where the gods have a clear ending, yet they're still there, and so that's just part of faith, I guess. Neither of these are religions, though, because neither of them have. Well, excuse me. This is where I would edit, but I'm going to move fast. I want to keep this going. You don't have any of this in Scandinavia, but you do have a druid class that arises that is sort of like a priest class, which would almost make it like a religion, because you would require some form of ceremony, a way to prayer, something like that, which are absent in the Nordic tradition. But certainly you do have that with the rise of the druids in the Celtic world as humans on this earth, and in our archaeological record of how we, the actual history as we know it. And so over time, the way that prior to Christian involvement, you're talking maybe, or even a certain amount during Christian involvement, but they're far enough back from the actual battles that are happening over closer to Italy and stuff like this, because these wars went on for hundreds of years before they were finally stamped out. And I say it like that because of the Irish particular story of St. Patrick's Day, how this tradition dies that day, and that's interesting that how that all shook out. But anyway, another tale why we think St. Patrick's Day is a good thing for the Irish. So back to the story. So that's where they come from. So the Fae themselves, as they become in the Celtic day-to-day experience, would be these woodland beings that live in the other world, this below. It's not literally below the ground. This place sort of near here. It becomes very close to a shamanic experience here, because you have this idea of a spirit world that you can connect with. But in this instance, what you have are actual Fae themselves, fairies, she, whatever you want to call them, that can at times come into our world. Whether or not we can go there, there's stories of people being taken into fairyland and dancing for 14 days and all this, and coming back and their feet being bloody and their toes gone. I mean, there's some really crazy other later stories that come when we have. But anyway, he gathered in the same way all the oldest tellings he could find, the people that were still somehow connected to this, and wrote it all down. And it is a fascinating read, because it reads of stories of people in the, you could conceivably think in like the 1500s, the experience that they describe is how they would, leave out, milk on a windowsill each night for the Fae, and in return for that, the Fae would protect their animals and things like this, and that's where you get that. Like, and there was a series, some series where they had a representation of a Celtic person, and they showed that. It was big. It was on HBO. Something, the gods of America, or something like American Gods. That's why they had that scene. But also there's these strange bounds. Like, okay, so we do this after so many generations of You know, the animals that we eat are from the land that we live on, and the plants and all that. And when we die, we go and bury our dead here. We're all here all the time. And they connected that also with this relationship with the Sidhe, that this had gone on from generation to generation. And so that way, it was very realistically sort of handed down in the way that beliefs in, like, oh, don't go by that rock and things like that, or something, you know, this certain area has a feel. Those grow from those places, or, you know, that's where those things originate in these kinds of scenarios as far as fairies are concerned. So that's how we get fairies. Now, fairies themselves, are they nice, friendly, blah blah? No, it's not like that at all. It's again, you're going into this sort of non-ordinary reality space of timelessness and abstracts, and that which is bad to you to happen actually helps you in some way, and, you know, all kinds of different ways of looking at things. And so too are the experiences between humans and fairies. All right, not saying that there's big bad evil fairies, but I guess in the realm of possibilities there could be some that you'd rather not deal with in some manner. What is the original story? Well, that's tradition. We'll have to give it at least that much respect. That was their spirituality. So, with that in mind, where we go next? Back to the Norse, more on the Celts. I'd love to talk about a lot of these subtopics, particularly when it comes to the Celts and the two-headed undead. I could go on for quite some time.